Now I give the floor to Mr. Zeynep Gündüz from RET, Protecting Through Education. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. I first would like to thank very much the permanent missions of Turkey, of Qatar, and of Portugal for inviting us to be here today, and High Commissioner Guterres, and of course High Commissioner from the Human Rights Council. I would like to say that RET was created by Sadako Ogata when she was High Commissioner of UNHCR in the year 2000. So in these last 15 years, we have been working together hand in hand with UNHCR, UNICEF, and with the international community in bridging the gaps that have been described to you today for the education of refugees. Mrs. Ogata was very precocious in her vision at the time, recognizing that while the world community was very focused on life-saving basic human needs of refugees, which is food, water, and shelter, in primary education, she considered it extremely important for the protection of youth and to have this youth educated in environments that are safe and protected and spaces where they can learn to flourish and channel their energies rather from the negative experiences they've had in political conflict or natural disasters, to channel their energies into positive and becoming positive agents of social change. As such, RET was created to provide this post-primary education to refugees, first in camps, and subsequently, as the trends have changed over the last 15 years, more and more of the refugees, as we are now seeing with the Syrian crisis, are rather not in camps, but in urban and rural areas in many of the neighboring countries. So what we would like to do today is, rather than repeat some of the experiences of our colleagues around the world, and some of the statements that have been made by His Excellencies and High Commissioner Guterres and my colleagues here, I'd like to really emphasize the great need to address the protection of youth who are so easily left behind, who are not educated, who fall between the cracks of humanitarian emergency assistance and development budgets around the world. Let's move on to the next chart, please. In the last 15 years, RET has worked in 26 countries, primarily where the major refugee crises have been, including in Afghanistan, Pakistan area, where there were several million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. We then accompanied the Afghan refugees back home to Afghanistan and were able to launch numerous education efforts, which you will see shortly, in Afghanistan to educate the vulnerable young women especially who had missed many years in school during their flight and exile in Pakistan. We move across the Silk Route and we move now to then the Syrian crisis, where the Syrian refugees are in both Lebanon and in Turkey, where we work in both countries. We continue to do our work while we are emphasizing our efforts in Syria with the Syrian refugees. We continue to do our work in what is referred to as the forgotten crises in Africa. This is something that's very critical because there are many protracted refugee situations throughout Africa. And I emphasize the Darfur refugees in Chad. We have been working with them for the last 10 years. And we have, together hand in hand with UNHCR, have shifted our strategy now towards looking at integration and looking at working with the Chadian curriculum for the education of these refugees. We continue to work with the Somali refugees in Kenya, and we have a foot in Somalia, hoping that as the repatriation is announced, gradually, drop by drop, foot by foot, one by one, the Somalis will eventually return to a much more stable Somalia. In addition, we continue to work in Burundi, where we've been for 10 years, where the Burundian refugees were originally in the neighboring country of Tanzania. We accompanied the 550,000 Burundians back home, renovated, reconstructed 200 schools for the education of these returning young refugee Burundians. And we worked with the host community in welcoming back these refugees who had left their country, many of whom were born in the refugee camps and didn't actually know Burundi or speak French or Kirundi. We work also in Eastern Congo with former child soldiers who were displaced internally, in essence, not necessarily refugees, but plucked out of their homes and recruited to join the various rebel groups in Eastern Congo. And we have 2 centers there where we are working to rehabilitate and reintegrate these young former ex-combatants into the communities and into the school system so that they can rejoin and reintegrate and be part of their communities in a positive and constructive way. As we move across Africa, now we move to the continent of South America and Central America. We have been working with the 3 million plus, as you know, internally displaced Colombians inside Colombia. We are working also in the neighboring countries in Ecuador since 2004, in Colombia itself actually since 2008, in Venezuela, in Costa Rica, in Panama, and we are now continuing to do our work up through Central America, moving on to Belize and the Northern Territories, where there's increased levels of migration due to the violence and conflict in Central America. In total, we have been able to work with 720,000 students around the world, and program participants, as we like to call them, because they are very actively engaged themselves in our programs. We are working also with approximately 20,000 educators, teachers on the ground, and about 550 RET staff who report directly to us. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Our toolbox, our education interventions around the world are quite numerous and various. I don't want to go into detail here and have you also struggle with trying to read what's on the board. We have packages for all who are interested and can follow up also with email. But I'd like to simply state that our interventions in education are not necessarily what everyone first thinks of as education, a classical formal education context as most of us here have enjoyed ourselves. But it can be psychosocial interventions, as my colleague from ROTA has described earlier. It can be a non-formal environment. It can be livelihoods. It can be vocational training. It can be education of refugee rights, education of children's rights, education of women's rights. It can also be preparedness for disaster risk reduction, working with ministries of education to build their capacities on the ground at the municipal levels, district levels, and also at the federal levels. So education, the umbrella of education is very broad, and depending on the needs assessment that we conduct in each country, each context, each school, each center, each area, working hand in hand with the host governments who allow us and give us that privilege of working with them. We ensure also with coordination with the UNHCR, with UNICEF, with UNFPA, and with our international NGO colleagues, that we bridge the gaps where they exist and are not redundant with other NGOs and other activities of host country ministries of education and host country other ministries such as women's affairs, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just some of the examples here, and I'll be very brief and really hope that, again, we follow up individually later. But our education programs, as an example, address a lot of vulnerable women. We include the example here of Afghanistan, where we worked with Afghan refugee women in Pakistan first at the request of the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan. These were women who were left behind, who had basically missed many years of schooling, and who therefore had every right to go back to school, but simply could not re-enter the school system in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. So we created centers of learning for them, teaching literacy, numeracy, catch-up classes, accelerated learning, 2 years in one, livelihoods training, how to set up a small business. Depending on the context and depending on which province and which district we were working in, depending on the ranking of the priorities of the host communities and the decision makers in those communities, including the elders, including the governors, including all the government authorities, we were able to customize our programs in each center to the needs on the ground. Using Afghanistan as an example, we were able to replicate our model 13 times in Afghanistan, where we have 13 centers for these young women, and take those lessons learned from Afghanistan to other countries around the world. Next slide. We share these experiences and positive learnings also in Latin America with young women, where these young women refugees from Colombia, as well as the young women in the neighboring countries in Ecuador, Venezuela, Costa Rica, Panama, were single heads of households and very vulnerable because they had many children, and especially youth who were being recruited into the rebel groups and into the paramilitaries for fighting, and also into child labor and early marriages. So there we took the approach that if we could stabilize the family unit and stabilize the mothers and provide bread on the table for the mothers, then the children and the young girls and boys who are of adolescent age and being recruited into these rebel groups could actually go to school and be protected in those school environments rather than be left idle and open for recruitment. With these lessons learned, we move on. We have launched our operations 18 months ago in Turkey. Again, bringing forward 26 countries of experience, all different and unique, and are now able to launch multiple multi-dimensional programs in Turkey, working hand in hand with AFAD, working hand in hand with the Ministry of National Education and the Ministry of Family and Social Policies to ensure that we are bridging the gaps that exist in Turkey for the 1.8 Syrian refugees who are there, and hopefully for the 400,000 children and youth who are currently not in school in Turkey. We have worked hand in hand with UNHCR thus far in setting up the women's programs. We have, again, with the same intentions and objectives as we have had in Latin America and in Afghanistan, by stabilizing the young women, the mothers, we are then able to protect better the youth who are very vulnerable to the political conflicts that are in neighboring Syria. Therefore, we have set up operations and are supporting 46 women's centers in Şanlıurfa province in Turkey, and expanding further now to Mardin province, working in the Chatoms in Mardin, and, which are the cultural women's centers there. And in addition, educating these women in these centers in non-formal ways, in livelihoods, in income-generating activities, so they can bring some money home to their families, and so that they can have their brothers and sisters and children be able to go to school themselves in the Turkish school system or in the temporary education centers that exist for the Syrians throughout Turkey. Next slide. We have also set up 4 schools so far along the Syrian frontier. These schools are to teach language to the Syrian children and to the Syrian youth. It's to teach the Turkish language so that as we are looking forward to possibly the next 10 years of this crisis, we are hoping that these Syrian children, through accelerated learning, will be able to learn Turkish and enter the Turkish school system so that we are not necessarily relying on having temporary education centers continue perpetually in Turkey. So our goal is to have all levels of Turkish A1 to C2, access to university level, provided for all the children, all the youth, and for the women, Syrian women inside Turkey. Next slide, please. All right. We are also continuing to be very focused on youth in general. So while we do have focus on young women and issues of young women and protection of young women, and children for education and youth for education. Our efforts in Turkey, and the next slide, in Lebanon, are focused on ensuring that the Syrian youth, together with host community youth in Lebanon, as an example, are trained and educated in leadership skills so that they can channel all of their energies in a very positive way to become agents of social change and to be very constructive in the future of the redevelopment of their home country, the reconstruction of their home country in Syria, and be able to be self-reliant in a very near future. And the next slide. Thank you. And as we described earlier, RET was created to bridge the gaps that exist in the international community, to bridge the gaps that exist between humanitarian assistance and development assistance, to bridge the gaps in education, in primary education to secondary education, bridging the gap to tertiary education, as High Commissioner Guterres also strongly encouraged, and to bridge all the gaps that exist amongst the international community actors, amongst all of our colleagues in other NGOs, so that, again, we're not all redundant, but we are all doing different projects, delivering different interventions and solutions on the ground, hand in hand with our host countries, host governments, and the international community, with UNHCR, UNICEF, UNFPA, and Human Rights Council together. So I thank you very much. I remind everyone of the commitments made at the World Education Forum in South Korea, as High Commissioner Guterres also did. We are here to create resilient education systems that also include refugees and IDPs. And we are here to bridge those gaps and ensure that education is amongst the first response efforts that we have. And we also bridge the gaps between those emergency responses to those of recovery and rebuilding the nations that have been caught up in political conflict and natural disasters. Thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gündüz, for telling us about this broad work RET is doing in the field, not only in the Middle East, but in every continent. And maybe 3 words that was striking for me. It was bridging the gaps, human rights education, it's very important, and adaptability, a person-centered approach, mothers, elders, including all these families, communities, and I think it's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to Monsieur.